Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And going to be a fun conversation today. I have a great guest on the show. We're going to talk about resources. You know, everybody wants a resource of where we can find out more about wine or whatever the topic might be. And today's episode is going to be about wine. And let me make the introduction to my guest, Kevin Day, founder, editor in chief of Opening a Bottle, the website. Kevin, how
I'm
you
doing
doing?
great. How are you doing, Rob?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for coming on the show and having a conversation with us
Well,
today.
thank you for having me. It's great. I've actually never been on a podcast, so this will be a fun experience for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just going to be a fun conversation, and our listeners, get to listen in a little bit, and hopefully learn a little bit about you, what you all do, and what you offer for them. And that's the big reason I wanted to have you on. I think you offer a service and information that for us wine lovers is very very good, and I think more people need to know
Well,
about it.
thank you. I really appreciate that sincerely. Yeah, it's a like a lot of things in wine, it's a labor of love, right? It starts off with a passion. You kind of fiddle with it, tinker with it, and the next thing you know, it becomes a thing that's larger than life. So a lot of work goes into it. It's a great opportunity to talk about it and to also have a conversation with you and maybe pick up some pointers myself. So.
I don't know about that, but we'll see. I noticed in kind of reading a little bit about you, you started out in the industry as just kind of a writer and photographer. And I always like to ask the question. I think your answer is a little bit different. A lot of people's might be similar. The wine journey,
Mhm,
the path to the passion and the love of
mhm.
wine. Yours seems to be a little bit different because I think it's kind of connected or tied to uh, writing and photography that kind of led you to finding wine. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, and I would throw a third element into that, which is travel. I mean,
Okay.
early on, my first career was as an editor of travel publications, but not like the Lonely Planet kind of travel guides. These were done for official, government bodies. So, like, the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority. I was the editor of their publication for a time, and the state of Colorado, their tourism office. So I was in the publishing business, in my 20s, and quickly, kind of as one of the younger people in that office, was kind of pegged as someone who could kind of help do some content development work on the internet to, help get us a little bit more of a diverse, kind of product mix, so to speak. So I always was really interested in putting together a publication and always, finding ways to get people inspired and motivated to travel. And really wasn't super into wine throughout much of my 20s. But my wife and I are foodies. I mean, that's one thing I relate to with you, Rob, is that, your podcast is really about, kind of how linked food and wine are together. And so we would cook at home, we would get all sorts of recipe books, and usually there was a bottle of wine that would go with it. But I wouldn't think too much about it. I was, we were casual wine drinkers. And then, the light bulb went off on a trip in 2008 to where else? Italy. And we were in Montepulciano in Tuscany. And we went to a wine bar that did a vertical tasting. I've never done anything like that before. And not only were all three of the wines really, really good and really, really different in just like a slight little way, but they were the same wine. They were from the same producer, made locally. It was just three different vintages. And it was one of those things where I was just like, you mean to tell me that these wines are different because of the weather? And that's it. I just couldn't wrap my head around
Yeah.
how cool that was. And so that started to really pique my curiosity. But again, I didn't really start writing about wine or going this in depth with it until about 2012. And that's when we returned to Italy with some friends, traveled with a great friend of mine named Adam, his dad's a collector of Burgundy. And so, Adam just kind of absorbed through his father, this wine knowledge. And we went to Barolo, and talk about having your mind blown. It's like, not only were we there
Yeah.
for truffle season and everything just was so luxuriant on the palate and on the plate and just everything that you were diving into, but that's where I started understanding that there were differences just from one vineyard site to the next. And we did some tastings. They've got a real nice tasting room right in the village of Barolo, and when we walked in there, they were doing a tasting of different soil types, and that just blew me away. And so I was trying to find a way to tie travel and writing and photography together. And that job that I was doing wasn't quite getting it done for me because it was very political. It was bureaucratic. There was a client. It was custom publishing. And so by
Sure.
2014, I started blogging about wine just to see if I could, do justice to what I was experiencing. And I also kind of figured, I got all these great photos from Barolo and from that area, and I got all these, other photos from Tuscany, and next thing you know, I was like kind of thinking that wine was the perfect vehicle for me to write about what I was experiencing and the people I was meeting, but also to tell that story through photos. And the longer I've been going at it, the less and less it's been about me, and that's a good thing. I think that's where I kind of got to a point where I was like, it's not really a blog anymore. It's kind of become a publication. It's become this big resource driven thing that's not about me. And, obviously when I write about a wine, I'm the one who's tasting it. I've got to translate it. So I'm not completely divorced from it. But nonetheless, what's really interesting to me is not the fact that I went there. It's what's there, right? That's the thing as a writer
Yeah.
that, you always try to get into that mode of really getting the reader to feel like they're experiencing it themselves. And that's a constant challenge. I
Right.
mean, some days I think I do it right. Some days I'm like, I could do better. But
Well, overall, I think, let's get into your
yeah,
website. I think it's great, and you nailed it as to what I thought about it. When I first, Bob sent it to me and said, "Hey, you need to check this out. I think you would like this website. I think it might be something you'd be interested in maybe having a conversation about." And man, he
thank
was
you. Yeah.
right, because when I looked at your website, it's exactly what you just said. It's a resource, and a lot of blogs and things. Obviously, it's about your experience, and those are fun to read and see what people are doing and how they're traveling, but yours really hit me because it's so focused for the wine consumer, the person who either has knowledge. It's not set up in a way where it's driven towards somebody who has no knowledge or somebody who is an expert. There's some content for everybody on there.
Thanks. Yeah, I kind of hit a point maybe 3 years ago where I stopped doing like the usual tasting notes, and I divided it into two paragraphs between wine beginners and wine obsessives. And I was like, it was a challenge to myself. Like,
Yeah.
okay, every time I write about a wine, can I tell someone who's new to wine why it's a great wine? Can I answer that question for them? And if I can't, maybe I shouldn't be writing about it. And then at the same time,
Right.
can I also tell a wine geek, someone who's obsessed with this stuff, why this wine is special? And if I can't answer that question, maybe I shouldn't be writing about it. So, I think that's kind of my audience, right? It's a little bit of both. I don't want to lose touch with the fact that wine is really intimidating for a lot of people, and they're curious and they're trying to find someone whose voice resonates with them, and that's a good thing. And there's a lot of great voices out there in the wine world. I mean, there's people who I read who resonate with me and that I learned from. I mean, everybody has that, and that's what makes wine a special community. But I don't want to lose that focus of being able to provide kind of the basics, but do it in a way that isn't just technical. It's story driven, and then also to satisfy the people who are really serious collectors or who are even in the wine trade, to give them something that makes the site resonate with them. So. I do, before I go any further, I want to give a shout out to my wife Haley, because not only is she the person who has been on this journey with me from the beginning and who cooks with me, but she's the website designer. So Opening a Bottle is a gorgeous website, and that's not me bragging about me. That's my wife's doing. She's very, very talented, and she's helped me really kind of compartmentalize a lot of my kind of thoughts into this website, and she's been a great partner in the whole thing. So, even though,
Well, let's give her
yeah,
another shout out, because she does this as a
yeah, she does.
profession. So Heyday Creative is the
That's
name of
right.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody's listening, needs some help with the website, there
Well,
you go.
yeah,
Reach out to her.
Haley's just very she's super artistic, very creative. Like, you give her a piece of paper and ask her to draw an animal or ask her to draw a landscape or something, and she just does this amazing creative stuff. But she's also like she's great at puzzles. And so, like, a
Yeah.
jigsaw puzzle and it gets done in no time. And so that lends to website design in a great way. She's been able to, like, really, I'll come up with some sort of thing like, I got this, I really want to have these icons on the site. How do we do that in a way that doesn't hurt how fast the site loads? It's a really technical thing to ask an
Sure.
artist to do. So she's been a really great partner in all of this, and I want to be able to, say that she's had a huge hand in the site and the success we've had with it. But just to kind of get back to the point of taking people there, that's an important thing for me. Is wine's a beautiful world to appreciate. Everybody who's been to a tasting room, been to a nice winery, or who's read about it or wants to go, they want to be taken there. And it's a privilege for guys like you and me who get to, go visit these places or who get to experience it, that, if we can translate that for people and let them see it and do it through photos or video, it's just a little bit more absorbing, I think. So
Yeah, and also it's meant to be shared with the
very
bottle,
much so. Yeah.
and I think that's a huge part of it, getting people to experience it with other
Yeah, that's
people.
kind of the nice thing about wine, right? It's
Yeah,
like you have a
absolutely.
beer, you're having the beer out of the bottle on your own, and that's great. That's beer. Wine's just that thing that's just meant to be shared. And, it's always, you usually have a bottle with somebody else or several people, and
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of times I'll go, "I got a bottle I wanna open." Well, I gotta wait, I gotta plan a dinner for that because I wanna make sure we have some
yeah,
people to
right,
share that with,
right, yeah, yeah, and it's
Absolutely.
not the same if you have it by
Well,
yourself, right? You're kind of like, but it's better with a
exactly,
friend.
exactly. Well, let's jump into the website. Let's talk a little bit about what this
Okay.
is, because we're telling people that this is a spot they need to go check out, and it's a resource for them. So let's go through what you offer, what your goal is to deliver for the consumer that comes to visit with
Well,
you.
I think the first thing to share is that to I got to a point too in my wine writing that I really wanted to specialize. So I was just finding that I was not I was stretching myself too thin trying to cover it all, right? And so and also when you're getting samples sent to you or you're getting opportunities to taste, to bounce around so much, it was just for me. I wanted to specialize. So the first thing to know about opening a bottle is it's really focused on European wines, mostly Italian and French wines. And part of the reason for that is the appellation system that they have in Europe speaks to me, because it's just so place driven. There's so many things that are wrong with appellations. There's a lot of politics involved. So that's not to say that they're all fine and dandy, but nonetheless, the idea that a wine can come from a specific place and it's unique to that place, that's a story that I've always liked to share and write about. So first thing is opening a bottle is mostly about those kinds of things. But then on top of that, it's about a lot of editorial topics that I think are confronting all of us as wine lovers, namely climate change, and namely, the use of land in a responsible way. I mean, wine is not, an agricultural product that society has to have for nutritional reasons. It's a nice to have. It's a luxury.
What? Wait, we don't need to. What? I
Well, we
don't
can
know,
debate this.
Kevin.
Maybe this is where we differ here, Rob. I mean,
I'm kidding.
it wasn't all that long ago though that we didn't have clean water in a lot of places, so wine was the substitute for that. In terms
Right.
of like using land, in a responsible way, but also finding, how that can sometimes lead to more interesting tasting wines. That's all really interesting to me. So I cover a lot of wineries and wine regions that have a focus on biodiversity, that have a focus on just stewardship of the land. That's a topic that I think is really interesting. So like right now on opening a bottle, the homepage story is about an Oregon winery, Troon Vineyards, which is in Southern Oregon, and it was because they're doing regenerative agriculture, and I just it was a story I wanted to pursue, and so I did an interview with them. So those are some of the things, but basically those are the topics that I cover, and the way that I cover them is through at wine education stories. So at the top of the site, you'll see the navigation, and one says "Get to Know Wine." Everything that's underneath there is education focused. Some of it through stories, and that's a way we learn a lot of times. So I'll have a section called "What the Winemaker Knows," and it'll be what I've learned by visiting a winery, having a conversation with a winemaker. There'll be a series of guides. They're called first taste guides. So if you want to know Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, I've never had Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. What's this wine like? That article will answer that question for you, and it'll do it in a way that I hope is engaging and gives you kind of a sense for, the place, what goes into it, what the ideal first bottle would be, what the next steps would be. So there's wine education articles. And then there's wine reviews, which are really, it's not a tasting. I mean, I do have tasting reports that are, kind of a summary of a trip that I went on, some of the top bottles that stood out to me, but it's not kind of like the consumer reports, drinking from the fire hose. Here's a grid with a bunch of point scores. I don't find that to be very interesting, and I don't find it to be very helpful, to be honest. So, the way I would do wine reviews is I've got a section called Wines to Admire. There's 50 of them, and the site is funded by subscribers. So I do have a paywall, and the wine reviews are part of what goes behind the paywall. But there's 50 of these wines to admire, and that's where I talked about the whole, wine a beginner might like, a wine obsessive might like. So the wines to admire, they're a good mix of French and Italian wines, a lot of Austrian wines now. That's an area that I'm really spending a lot of time researching, is Austria and its great white wines. You'll have some Spanish mixed in. You'll even have some from the United States if it's got a good story behind it. But each wine review has that. It has a little kernel of a story. So, and I'll have a little subhead below it that tells you how long the words are. So, that it's not a big commitment. And, it's like a recent one I wrote about a Riesling from Alsace. And, the subhead was 450 words or so in which we pump Riesling tires yet again, possibly to no avail, right? Because it's one of those things where it's like,
Right.
wine professionals love to write about Riesling and talk about Riesling. And it's just so funny how so many people don't get Riesling, and we're all just kind of banging our heads against the wall that, someday we'll get everybody on board with Riesling. And I'm one of those people. So I
Right.
felt like it was, as I started writing, I'm like, boy, I've done this like 5 or 6 times. Maybe I'll just acknowledge the fact that, that we sometimes struggle to get people on board with these wines. So, there's always a little bit of a narrative with the wine reviews. And then,
Let
yeah,
me ask you about your
sure.
reviews. So a lot of times you'll hear that, hey, look, if you're going to look for somebody to kind of align yourself with, you need to make sure that your palate's aligned,
Yeah,
right? But I a lot of times can also take the opposite approach and say, I'm looking for somebody to tell me, more, are these quality wines, not so much are they just wines they enjoy or they
yeah.
like. So do you do a balance of making sure that you're somewhat objective as far as the quality of the wine, and then also, a little bit of subjective in there of what you like and don't like?
That's a great question. Yeah, because it's, so many wine critics, they have a specific palate, specific style, and they'll reward
Yeah.
wines that based on whether they fit their tastes. I mean, it's taste, right? Taste is very personal to a lot of people, and I think, that's one of the, first things you'd want to tell somebody who's new to wine, who wants to get into wine, is, find someone who you trust, who can give you good recommendations, and that doesn't have to be a wine critic. It could be a friend. It could be the guy at your local wine shop who, understands things. It could be, the sommelier, and how she, the restaurant that you visit, and how she always has, a great answer for something that goes with food pairings, and so finding that voice that you trust is certainly important. If someone's looking at my site and they want to know what my palate profile is, I tend to like lower alcohol wines. I tend to like wines that are a little bit more, elegant, that have a little bit more of a life to them. That maybe, they're obviously, we talk about complexity. Who doesn't love, a wine that's got complexity?
Sure.
For me, I want to enjoy this wine over a few days, and I want it to say something different to me each time. And that's a trait for someone like you and me who likes to, home cooks, right? I mean, you've probably had several wines where you're like, this is really good, but I gotta pump the brakes tonight because I want to see what this is going to say tomorrow night.
Did
You
it
did it
this
this
weekend.
weekend, yeah. To me, that's a really,
Yeah.
we don't talk enough about that in the wine biz. Like the fact that a wine can have many different personalities to it, and so I try to write about that aspect as well. Um, Beyond that, I mean, I think it's important to also talk about versatility with food pairings. But food pairings are dicey because food pairings are also very cultural. People have a specific diet that works for them. They may have a cultural background where they eat a certain type of food style. Maybe they tend to eat more spicy food than I do. Maybe they tend to eat more, higher, vegetables. It's just when you say pair this wine with this exact recipe, for me that doesn't really work. So
I
yeah,
agree. And I agree with you that it doesn't have to be a specific wine. It's more about the characteristic of
yeah,
the wine. When you talk about spicy food, that's when we might be able to get people into Riesling a little bit with that residual sugar that kind of
sure,
offsets the
sure.
spice. because a higher alcohol wine you definitely don't want with
What I
spicy
would
food.
love for people to look at is the versatility of the wine. So when I talk about food friendliness, and every one of my little wine reviews has just a simple bullet point that says food friendliness, and I use 5 different ratings, and they tend to be highly versatile or exceptional, or a soloist. That's the opposite end of the spectrum. So a
Ah,
soloist would be, it's not a bad thing. It's just it could be what they call a meditation wine, right? Like you're not necessarily going to have this with food, but maybe you'll have it on its own and appreciate it. Or it really just works with, a richer protein, or
it,
something like that.
it can, or it could be just a porch pounder that you don't have to think about. You
Yes,
can just sit out back with a friend and have a
absolutely.
glass.
And then you have those other
Yeah,
wines that just seem like they work with everything, right? Like you don't have to think about it. You can just you can have them with with fish. You can have them with beef. You could have them with any number of things. Champagne for me is that kind of wine. Champagne's so versatile, and
yeah,
people don't even think to have champagne oftentimes with dinner, but let alone with beef or with pork, or something that's a little bit more protein driven that maybe we would.
even steak
Steak, exactly.
sometimes.
Red wine territory, right? I mean, to me,
Yeah,
people should feel encouraged to break those boundaries, and then I can learn from them. They can tell me what hey, that worked. Thanks for recommending that wine. It worked great with X Y Z, and I never thought of pairing it with X Y Z. I'll have to try that next time. So to me, that's
right.
one of the little resource things, is talking about food friendliness in terms of versatility, not in terms of like exact food pairings. I think that really narrows the conversation about wine in a bad way, so I try to avoid it. Um, and then I also flag every wine that I review with a series of icons, so that just at a glance, if you get used to using the site, you'll be able to tell, oh, this wine's organic, it's biodynamic, or it's comes from a heroic vineyard, or it's an old vines wine. I do a lot of research when I profile a wine on all the traits that went into it. I call it wine icons. So they're these little graphical icons that Haley designed, that shows up next to each of these wineries and their wines. And it's some of the stuff that you don't really see on the surface. A lot of it's not on the label. So, I mean,
Yeah. But it's brilliant,
thanks.
Kevin. I mean, I love that you do this because I mean, it's just a quick glance that gives me so much more information that I think a lot of us in the world of just consuming goods today want. If you're going to eat a steak, you want to know where that cow pastured
Yeah,
and so on
yeah,
and so forth. So wine's the
yeah.
same way. So I think it's great
I
that you
think
do
one of
that.
the things I would love for people to get if they kick around opening a bottle for long enough is an appreciation for the toil that goes into making a wine, and that's something I take my
Yeah.
hat off to winemakers for, and also makes me a little leery of like pontificating about wine too much, because I've never made wine before. Who am I to say, right? But nonetheless, as someone who appreciates wine and who's visited a lot of wineries and seen what they're up against just to bring that wine to fruition, Old Vines is a good example of that. We have a lot of wines will be tout the fact that they come from old vines. Well, for one, what does that mean, right? I mean, a 40-year-old Grenache vine might not be all that old compared to a 150-year-old Grenache vine, but a 40-year-old Pinot Noir vine, well, that's actually pretty old for Pinot Noir, right? So we have this sliding scale as it is with old vines, but on top of that, you also get your own set of headaches working with old vines. They can be really low in yields. They could be obviously they tend to be a little bit more resilient against some of the maladies that you might have in a vineyard, whether that's a pest, whether that's bad weather. But nonetheless, if I can verify that a wine comes from older vines for that particular grape variety, I'll put that little icon there because I want people to appreciate what the winemaker was up against, utilizing that. And the same goes especially for heroic viticulture. That's the thing that I'm really passionate about. People don't talk too much about what heroic viticulture is, which the definite it's a phrase that I didn't coin, but it's basically it takes a hero's effort to actually work on such a vineyard. So usually we think of steep slopes with this, like ridiculously vertical, terraced, walled vineyards. And to me, that's backbreaking work. Oftentimes these wines that come from heroic vineyards, they'll be a good 600-700 hours more labor per year than a standard vineyard, and yet the wine isn't 6 or 7 times the cost. It's mind blowing. So Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
flag that kind of stuff because I just think it's really what makes wine just so interesting as a product compared to kind of anything else.
And when you get into wine, flagging it for that reason, the difficulty of it, but also how important those kind of slopes are,
Yeah.
the direction it is and things like that, the part it plays into what you eventually get in the bottle.
Hmm.
And that's why they do it, because some folks might go, well, why are you putting vines there? There's a
Yeah.
reason. And they do that extra work because it pays off in
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah, they do. They do. But it's, there's always that tension that, the next generation might not put in the toil and the labor
Yeah.
to preserve that vineyard because it's just not worth it anymore. And who can blame them, right? Like you got to do what's right for your family and for your career, and maybe going to a city and getting into marketing or doing something completely different than
Yeah.
viticulture is what's right for your generation. But you run up against this time and
Sure.
time again when you report on wines, particularly in Europe where so many of the wineries are family, centric, multi-generational affairs. There's that tension of, will the next generation, take up the banner and keep this going? And if not, who will? It's interesting. It's a very interesting kind of thing that I see often that I try to write about and try to capture the spirit of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you want to jump into, you have another tab at the top, the learn with us.
Oh yeah,
You do some things there.
yeah. That's actually a big part of opening a bottle. Is I do live wine classes, and for my paying subscribers. So they're oftentimes deep dive wine classes. So we've got one on October 8th. They'll be coming up. I'm just going to put it up on the website later today. But it's going to be actually a talk with Bob Polinsky, who you just had on your
Oh, yeah.
podcast, Master of
Yeah.
Wine. Bob and I met in Abruzzo back in June, and just really hit it off. And just fascinating guy to talk about wine, as you know, and as your listeners know. And so we're going to tag team this class on Abruzzo's wines. And for me, what's going to be exciting about that? These classes are held on Zoom, so I do a big presentation with photographs from where I've gone. We'll do some maps that show you where you are. I'll even put in some pointers about if you plan to go there, if you want to travel, here's some things to keep in mind. A little bit of history, a little background on the, what makes this area unique. And I also provide my subscribers with a buyer's guide to that category of wine. So just this morning, I published that for the Abruzzo class. So if you're looking for Pecorino Abruzzo, what do you look for? If you're looking for Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, what are you looking for? And so that way people kind of are empowered to know how to shop for that category of wine. And then when they show up for for the class, they've got, a couple wines on hand, and, we go ahead and have a tasting. And so as I go through the class, we usually pause and discuss the wines. And Bob's going to join. And what's going to be fun about that is he'll be able to tell people some things that are, on the technical level, well beyond my scope. And he also has just a very interesting way. If you've seen his YouTube videos, when he tastes wines, he goes through it with such a thoughtful approach that there's always something to learn from him. So I'm really excited about that. Those classes, I usually do one a month from about October to April. Usually by the time summer rolls around, people just don't want to be on Zoom, and I
Yeah.
totally get it. So I've done some summer classes that've been lightly attended, and my thought was, let's just put the efforts into those classes in the fall and in the winter and early spring. And the videos are up there on an archive. So if somebody missed my class on Barolo and Barbaresco, they missed my class on Alto Adige or on Chablis. There's a video. They can watch it there, which is kind of a nice perk of a subscription.
And so what you're saying they could actually do is just start the video,
Mm-hmm.
see what wines you have, stop, go buy some, and then come back and
Totally.
finish watching as they taste. That's kind of
Why
a
not?
cool thing that you could do.
Why not? Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I've got one subscriber in North Carolina who, he gets together with his friends, and if they miss it, they watch the video, and they, they're retired and they're having a great time, kind of, having little wine tasting parties. It's an
Yeah.
excuse to open multiple bottles, and I frequently tell people, because the wines that we usually cover, to go back to that earlier point, they're the kind of wines that you can cork, put in your fridge, take out a couple days later. They're still going to taste great. They're still going to be fine.
Yeah.
They might be saying something different. But if you have all three of them open side by side and you're doing that comparison tasting at home, and you're not driving anywhere, you don't have to worry about getting an Uber or whatever that is, you can kind of tell those differences. And it goes back to, my origin story, right? And in Montepulciano, way back in, 2008, where I had a vertical of 3 different vintages and had my mind blown by the differences. I haven't gotten over that moment, clearly, because I'm teaching classes centered on that concept.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Um, so I wanted to talk about your rating system too.
okay.
It's something on your website I really enjoyed, and I think you do a good job of. You want to talk about your approach to rating the wine?
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't want to get too hung up on the overall score, right, of a wine
Well,
because,
let me ask you this to
yeah.
start. What do you think about the 100-point system? Because I feel like it's now a 10-point system, isn't it? Everything needs to be 90 or above.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, everybody gets an A, right?
Yeah,
I got problems with it. Yeah, I do. I mean,
yeah,
I think it disincentivizes people to really learn about wine, for one,
yeah.
because it's so reductive. Not to use another wine term that means something completely different, but you just reduce wine down to, you know, some tasting notes that are usually, personal experiences that taster had when they went through that wine, and a
And it
number.
could have been after 70 glasses before they got to that one.
Exactly, usually is exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, I mean, I'm human. I'll go. I mean, later this week, I'm going to Mount Etna, and there's going to be a day where we have a technical tasting, and I love and loathe those days on the road because, you meet so many great people, you get a real good sense for what these places are all about. But after a while, you're also not quite grabbing onto the wine in a meaningful way that you can actually write about it. You have to
Yeah.
take a break because the palate fatigue is real. And that's a lot of times the way these wines are assessed and judged and scored is through, kind of going through 60, 70 wines in a day. A wine that'll stand out to you in that crowd is going to stand out to you for different reasons than it would at the table. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect. I mean, I used to question whether a wine critic actually had the faculties to do what they do. And having gotten to know a few of them and seen some people, I mean, to see a real professional do this work is pretty amazing. And I do give them credit for being able to parse those details, but I still think they're tasting in a vacuum. And I think
Yeah.
to put all of our, eggs in that basket of a point score and a process in which wine is tasted at that level, it's problematic. The flip side of it is that in order to be comprehensive and in order to review, a beat, so to speak, the wines of the Southern Rhone. Well, there's so much wine produced in the Southern Rhone that critic is asked to review so many of them throughout the year. That's the only way they're going to get through it, right?
Yeah.
They're going to miss a lot of what's going on there if they don't taste it that way. So it's a double-edged sword. So when I review my wines and rate them, I mean, I still use a system of kind of, an at a glance assessment, which is a star rating. And, mine's up through 5 stars. I mean, you could scale that out to 20 points. You could scale that out to 100 points and say it's the same thing. And I'd be like, yeah, you're right. It is. I don't want people to get too hung up on that rating. It's meant to be, for me, if it's a 5-star wine, 5 out of 5, that's not a 100-point wine to me. And I say that on the site. To me, it's the potential of this wine is really, really top. Like, just let's see where this goes. Let's revisit this wine. This is a wine to get very excited about.
Yeah.
If it's 4.5 stars, it's a very good wine. It's very typical of, that's that category of wine. It has the potential to kind of swing either way. I've thought it's one of those things I scrutinize a lot about, the editorial direction of opening a bottle is, do I just even get rid of the stars or not? Because I'm not sure how helpful they are. But for me, it provides a good yes or no on whether I'm going to write about something or not. So if it's a 4.25 stars or so, which you could scale out with a 100-point system and say, oh, it's a what is it, an 82-point wine or something like that. Well, then no, I'm not going to write about it. So it gives me a threshold to say, okay, if I'm going to put something in the wines to admire section, it's got to be a good wine. What have I had lately that fits that bill? So it's a little bit of like a threshold for me to kind of pick and choose what goes on the site and what doesn't. I think probably what's more helpful for people is the actual paragraph that follows, which is a wine beginner might like, a wine obsessive might like, as well as, how to utilize that wine from a versatility standpoint and whether the wine's
Right.
overpriced or not. I have a value thing there too. Usually if it's overpriced, I'm not writing about it either. So, but at the same time, if a wine is, $50, and to me, it's like, well, that's typical. That's expected. I'll say as expected. So the value is as expected.
Yeah.
If
Because I
it's,
would say us wine geeks, we're always looking for that wine, or at least I think we are, that wine that punches up. Something I
yeah,
pay $30 for, but
yeah,
I'd
for
be
sure.
like, man, I'd be happy to pay 50 for this, but I'm glad I'm paying 30.
Yeah, yeah, and I would also add to that, what goes into the wine has to be factored in too. Like, how hard was it to bring this wine to market? And because you if there's more work
New
involved,
oak on the wine.
well, that would be one example. But even like a traditional method sparkling wine, it's a very technical process, and it takes a lot
Yes.
of time. If the wine is aged in the cellar for 2-3 years before they release it, well, that's they're sitting on product for a long time that they're not realizing any cash flow for. And also to go back to heroic vineyards, if the slope that they're harvesting this fruit from is really difficult to operate, if it's really requires quite a bit of labor, and the wine is $35 and it tastes like a $35 wine, I'll still say, well, it's actually exceptional value given what went into it, right?
Yeah.
It's not an ordinary $35 wine. The labor that went into it means it probably they ought to be charging more for it. So it's complicated. It's hard to just. I understand the temptation to reduce everything down to its simplest form, create a comprehensive thing so people can just go, this demystifies wine and I've got it. And now I'm just going to only buy 90-point wines, or I'm only going to, buy wines that smell like tobacco, right? Or whatever the
Well,
taste
yeah.
du jour is, right? It's just,
Well,
for me,
and
wine
and
doesn't.
I always laugh, Kevin, because I think you're right. I think you're nailing it. You're the resource. You're doing that work for us, and that's why opening a bottle is so great. That most of us average wine drinkers or new wine drinkers, we don't look into that. We don't look at the yields, and a lot of new wine people don't even know what that we mean by the yield of the vines, and how
Yeah,
important
right.
that is to the quality of the wine in the bottle. But I would also say that it's just important that we get that information from somebody who can help us educate. Because if you look at, I look at the wine rankings that come out, the awards every year, and sometimes you'll see the number one wine in the world was a 96-point wine, but number 30 was a 100-point wine. And I always
Yeah.
go, how can that be? How can that be?
Yeah, and then you look at the advertising dollars that went into that publication. You go, oh, that's
Yeah, exactly.
that's
So
that's another thing too. I mean, not to keep pumping the tires on opening a bottle, but it's ad free. Like, I just didn't want to get into that mess. Was having
sure.
advertisements on there. So I do have some professional subscribers, and if a company buys a professional subscription, and they've had coverage about their wines or about their region's wines. I do thank them at the bottom with a little, thank you to our professional subscribers thing. But that's it. It's not. I'm not looking to, have advertisements on the site. To me, that detracts from the photography, and so as a result, I don't make as much money on the site. But so be it.
Yeah, but I think it keeps you in most people's mind very credible. If they don't know you, they can just assume if there's not advertising, this guy's a straight shooter, which I
Yeah.
think means something.
And it's important to note too that I do get a lot of perks here. So I oftentimes get samples, right? They get sent to me,
Sure.
and I will disclose that at the bottom. This wine was provided as a sample, and I have an editorial policy. If you want to learn more, read about it. And also, if I got invited on a press trip, this week I'm going to Mount Etna, and that's a press trip. And the way that works is that you, as a member of the international wine media, scene, if they want you to write about their wines and they want to introduce their product to you, they invite you to an annual event like this one that I'm attending. And I always say editorial's not guaranteed. I mean, obviously by going, there's a good chance I'm going to cover it, but the final decision on what gets said and what gets written about is up to me. But even in that case, a reader needs to know that that's how I got over there and that's why I was there.
Yeah.
And if I was completely independent, I'd have to be independently wealthy. I mean, there's just no other way of writing about
Right.
wine without having a big bankroll behind it. So and it's that way with a lot of publications. It's that way with a lot of blogs. It's that way with a lot of those things. So am I completely 100% squeaky clean? You know, I don't think so. I mean, I go.
Nobody is. Yeah.
Nobody is. Nobody
Yeah.
is. I mean, the media landscape is brutal. It's hard to make money
Well,
doing it. So, it is what it is.
let's we've mentioned subscriber a few times now, and the listeners are going, okay, what's it cost for me to get this good information?
Sure.
So let's tell them real quick what you offer as far as subscriptions on your site.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I don't mean to be selling it too much. So there's two types. There's individual subscriber and there's professional subscriber. The professional subscriber is really meant for companies who want to have multiple logins to the site. So that would be like a PR company that wants to be able to republish my content if I write favorably about a wine that they represent. They also have the ability to have 5 different logins for their staff, and I also will aggregate a page of all their content that represents them. So that's a perk for them, and that's $139 a year. But for individuals, it's quite a bit more affordable. So just an ordinary wine lover, they have 2 options. They can do $5 a month, and they can cancel anytime. So if they want to join a class, they can do $5 and then stay on the site for a few months or whatever. Usually they stay for longer because it's good, I hope. And then the annual subscription is $49 a year, which is quite a bit, a little bit of a better deal. So $49 gets you access to the whole site. You can view any of the wine reviews. There's also a very thorough, comprehensive section of the site that, looking at the analytics, I know it doesn't get a whole lot of traffic. It's exclusively for subscribers, but it's my curated list of who the best wineries are. And so each winery that fits that gets their own comprehensive page that has not only a write-up on why their wines matter, and not only a series of write-ups on the wines that you should look for, but also the traits that make that winery unique, a map to show you where it is, photographs of the winemaker and their vineyards, all the things that I can kind of bring to the table. Those, and then also related articles that tie into that winery or their wine region. I mean, to me, that's where I want people to get lost on the site, is the essential winemakers section.
Well,
And that's behind the paywall. That's for subscribers only. So that's a real big perk, I think, for people who, for $49 a year, they can read up to, there's about 100 of them right now on the site. So it's kind of a place to kind of figure out where you want to get your next bottle of wine, is how I see it.
yeah, and the reason I think that's fantastic and so important, and I'll let everybody know, I checked out your site. I went through everything, and I'm now a subscriber.
Thank you very
Um,
much, by the way.
yeah, but no, I love that you do that with the winemakers, the essential winemakers of these regions, because when you think about old world wines, it's all about region as far as what's on the bottle, Bordeaux,
Mhm.
or it's Cote de Rhone, or it's Burgundy. And it's easy to figure out regions and the grapes that belong to those regions. The hardest part for me is to go, okay, now who's a good producer?
Mhm.
And you helping with that, because I think that's just really is the hardest part of navigating old world wines, is narrowing it down to the good producers of those wines.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's times where I also, will be, asking myself some questions about that section of, is this, okay, this group of winemakers I have for this region, is this comprehensive enough? I have in my head, like, okay, I need to revisit this region. I haven't been there, tasting those wines for a couple of years. I need to freshen things up a little bit. So it
Yeah.
helps me with my editorial process to have that section, because I want to be thorough and comprehensive, particularly with both Italy and France. So that's what these sections are. My goal is that I'll have one for Austria within the next year or two. Would
Okay.
be a smaller list, but it would still nonetheless be essential winemakers of Austria, just because I think I'm just so into those wines right now.
Very cool.
But it's tricky, like Piedmont, for example, in Italy. I mean, that is an all-star team of wineries in Piedmont. I mean,
Well,
they're all
let's do this.
superstars. right?
I if you're okay with it, let's go through. I've got some things to ask you about Italian wines,
Yeah,
Italy,
absolutely. Yeah.
and then the same questions for the French. So if we could, let's go through some of these and get kind of your thoughts, and then we'll finish in each of these categories, each of these countries with your we'll call them your favorites or your tops of
Yeah.
the
Okay.
essential winemakers.
Yeah.
Uh,
Go
but
ahead. Fire
starting in
away.
Italy, do you have some favorite regions just for style of wine, what you like? And then
Mm,
maybe a couple of what you might call bang for your buck areas, wines under the radar.
yeah. Okay. Um, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. There's like, which wine region would you want to visit, right now if you could be transported, and that's, then there's also, instead of this, what would you, or, what would be a good alternative to it? For me, it's real easy to say Barolo because I mentioned Barolo earlier as like the place that I really discovered, the terroir concept, right? It was, that's where the light bulb went off for me. And I do genuinely love and admire Barolo and the Barolo producers that are there. But I think my admiration is also just the whole world of Nebbiolo. I love Nebbiolo. It's like
Yeah.
it's just the second it hits my nose, coming out of a glass, it's like I'm home. Like it's just so familiar. It's so fascinating and so unlike any other grape out there that I just love Nebbiolo. And to me, the favorite region that stands out is Valtellina. It's not
Okay.
talked about a whole lot. Valtellina is in Lombardia. It's near Lake Como. It's in the Alps, squarely in the Alps, and this is like heroic viticulture to the extreme. I mean, I think only the Douro River in Portugal has more walls holding up the vineyards than Valtellina has. So you have this stretch of valley and the south-facing slope. It's an unusual valley because in the Alps most of the valleys kind of run north-south. This one goes east-west, and it's centered on the city of Sondrio. And the south-facing slopes of Valtellina are all just terraced with vineyards. They have something like, I want to say the number's 2,000 miles of stone walls in this one
Wow.
valley. So if you'd like do the math, I remember doing it once because I'm based in Denver. That's where I live. It would be from Denver to Philadelphia is the distance of stone walls, all in this one valley, all for viticulture, and it's impossibly steep. And so those are really interesting wines too because they're like Barolo and Barbaresco in terms of you pick up some of those notes, but to me they're more mineral. And I know that's like a controversial term. Minerality for me is more of an emotional feeling. It's a textural thing. It's kind of like it's just something that will trigger a memory that's stony, right? It's not a
Okay.
technical, like there's a substance in the wine that's mineral. But with Valtellina, so many of the wines there, they smell like a rainstorm to me. Like it's like Barolo meets a rainstorm. So the aromas in Valtellina are really interesting. And the wines are a little bit more lean in profile. They're not nearly. They've got enough structure to age well, particularly from certain producers, but I just think they're really fascinating. They've got there's two styles. There's actually three styles. There's Rosso di Valtellina, which is kind of the entry level. You have your Valtellina Superiore, which is kind of like the best wine in my opinion. Those are like the age worthy competitors for Barolo and Barbaresco. And then they have Sforzato di Valtellina, and Sforzato is basically the Amarone treatment. So
Oh, really?
they'll age the grapes on usually on trays to concentrate the sugars. Then they'll press that and make a very rich wine. I had one this weekend from Nino Negri, a Sforzato, and talk about like an improbable wine. You have heroic viticulture, steep slopes, all this toil that goes into getting the grapes, and then you're losing most of your crop because you're age drying it, and so you need more grapes per bottle just to
Yeah.
make this product. So Valtellina is just really, to me, a region that's very fascinating. I also have to say that, like, in terms of wine regions that are really on the up and up. I know it's like the most famous one in Italy, but Chianti Classico right now is a region that we all ought to be paying attention to because of uh, how rapidly the wines there are improving. And I mean that in
Okay.
a way that, like, just when I started doing opening a bottle, a lot of times I'd taste Chianti Classico wines and I would be like, okay, it's kind of, this is what it is. And I think
Yeah.
they've pushed the boundaries so much in the last 10 years that you just have this unbelievable amount of variety within that one zone. And having visited it just last year and really gotten an appreciation for the role that the forests of Chianti Classico play in the vineyards. I mean, the forests help keep a lot of the air temperatures cool. And Sangiovese needs that. Sangiovese is a grape that really is fickle. It wants specific conditions. And because a majority of Chianti Classico is mountains covered in forest that are preserved and have been preserved for hundreds of years, you get these kind of cool air currents at night that go through the vineyards. And the producers there are doing a great job of scaling back on oak, scaling back on extraction and heaviness, and also moving away from the international varieties and putting them in the blends and really embracing the primacy of Sangiovese. They've also done a lot of genetic studies on Sangiovese so that they know more what they're dealing with in terms of which clones get planted in the right spots. There's just so much to dive into with Chianti Classico. And oftentimes you can drink really well with the Annata bottles, which are the annual ones, just the simple Chianti Classico. You don't have to do Reserve and Gran Selezione to have a great wine there. So that's a
The other
region.
thing I want to throw in right there is value. It's a
Yeah,
great value region as well.
totally is. Totally is for now. I mean,
Yeah, for now.
for now it is. But
Yeah.
I mean, I frequently think about Chianti Classico and then Rosso di Montalcino, Brunello di Montalcino, and I mean, there's a few producers in Montalcino that I just really adore, and I understand like when you hit the mark with Brunello di Montalcino, what an epic wine that can be. Um, but boy, I'd probably put my attention more towards Chianti Classico just because I'd have a better batting average buying wines from there because the
Yeah.
conditions are just so good there. So, um, but beyond that, I mean, other
What about the region you're going to? I've
Etna,
been drinking a lot of that wine. Yeah.
yeah, Etna's. I'm almost like pausing on Etna right now just because I'm going and I don't want
Yeah.
to
I don't want to, but
rave
you
too
like the
much
region.
about
We'll
it.
just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another heroic viticulture area. So it's on the side of Mount Etna in Sicily, very high altitude. That's another trait of heroic viticulture is the high elevation can play a role. Oftentimes terraced, super volcanic soils. So that's one of the icons I use is volcanic soils. You get this salty kind of character to the wine, and I'm not sure what that's from. I mean, that's a question for our friend Bob, right? Like,
Yeah.
why are volcanic wines so different? I mean, I can taste it. I definitely know I can taste it. But they just have this lean finish. Like there's a lot that's there. There's complexity, but it just kind of comes off the palate in such a clean as a whistle sort of way that you just want to return to it. It's like the same way that you return to a salty bag of potato chips that you can't stop eating. It's Etna wines are like that. You just keep, wanting to parse more of the details from it. And I really like
Sure.
Etna Bianco.
I do too.
Etna Bianco. I don't know if have you had this experience with it where you open it and you're almost like, where is it? Like there's nothing there on the nose. Like you're just kind of like, why is this so shy and reserved? And then you wait 15 minutes and it's like, hello. It just like comes flowing out of the glass. Like, do you ever have that with it?
My wife and I have had that
Me.
exact experience a couple of times.
Okay.
Absolutely have.
Yeah.
Yep.
So to me, I like that. I like a wine that's got a personality to it where it's like,
Yep.
oh, you're playing hard to get, like
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
fun, and I like knowing that insider tip that like, okay, just be patient, wait it out.
Yeah. I'll
Don't
show
give
up
up.
when I'm ready. Yeah.
Totally. Don't give up on this wine. Give it a few minutes. And
Yeah.
that goes back to
Exactly.
our point earlier about, judging wines based on a lineup of 70 and you just give it that one quick taste, you write your notes, you move on to the next one. That kind of reviewing it doesn't talk about this story, which is for me as a consumer, I want to know that, that's a quirk about, Etna Bianco wine. So I'll be asking about that trait specifically when I'm there, because I think the winemakers who deal with it, they'll be able to talk about that, much better than I ever could. That might make an interesting article. But
Well,
Sicily for me, like is Sicily's just there's so much there that's, we talk a lot about Etna because it's just getting all this attention, but there's a lot of great value wines coming out of Sicily right now.
and indigenous grapes, that a lot of folks maybe don't know about.
The thing with Sicily is that it almost had to embrace international varieties in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s to get people's attention that they could make great wine in Sicily, which, in hindsight, you're like, of course they can make great wine in Sicily. Like the
Yeah.
heritage and history of Sicily is insane, right? Of course it's great terroir for that. Um, but so you had a lot of those wines that were Syrah based, Cabernet based in Sicily, and now that everything's pivoted back towards the indigenous varieties of Sicily, it's really a promising time. I mean, even since I started, studying Italian wines and writing about Italian wines, the trajectory of Catarato, which is the most widely planted grape in Sicily, it's used for Marsala mostly. I mean, people were talking about it like it was just kind of a terrible grape just 10 years ago. And I've had so many wines from Catarato lately that have just defied that. It's
Yeah.
got a real interesting personality to it if you give it the care and attention that it warrants, and that's kind of one of those common themes that shows up anywhere I go with wine. So
Well, finishing up on Italy, I know
yeah.
it's behind the paywall, but would you mind sharing, a couple or three essential winemakers in Italy
Oh,
that you can
sure.
share with our
Absolutely. Yeah.
listeners?
Well, I mean, again, I'm coming at this from a storyteller perspective, right? So like
Okay.
um, and for me, when you open a bottle with somebody, and it's like called opening a bottle, it's the root of it is, it's a conversation piece, right? Like, what are you going to talk about?
Absolutely.
It's a great wine, but you're not going to be talking about the dry extract, right? You're not going to be talking about the pH numbers, and the technical. Let's have a conversation about this text sheet over our meal. You're talking about the origin and where that wine comes from. And last November I went to Friuli and visited
Okay.
the Collio DOC area, and then had a couple of days off on my own to explore. And I drove up into the Friuli Colli Orientali area and went up into the Chiala Valley, which is right on the border with Slovenia. I actually almost got lost and drove into Slovenia to get there. And there's this winery up there called Ranchi di Chiala, which a lot of Italian wine, aficionados know very, very well. And Ranchi di Chiala is known for saving this grape variety from extinction called Schiupatino. And Schiupatino uh, is back in the 1970s, it was actually outlawed that you couldn't plant Schiupatino, and they broke the law to go and find whatever wild vines of Schiupatino they could to preserve it. So they make this incredible red wine that it'll remind you of Pinot Noir, it'll remind you of Nebbiolo, it'll remind you of Alpine wines, it'll remind you of the sea. So their Schiupatino is just fantastic, and they also make a really nice white wine blend called Chiala Bianca, or is it Chiala Bianco? I might be wrong on that one, but that either way, they're just fantastic wine producers. That's the Rapuzzi family, wonderful people. But what I really globbed onto with them was not only that they saved this grape, but their valley is like 90% forest and wild, and that's
Oh,
really
wow.
important to them is biodiversity. And the winemaker is actually a world-renowned entomologist who has studied beetles, and he has one of the largest collections of ground beetles in the world. And he's used what he's learned from studying insects to make decisions in the vineyard to support more biodiversity and more life within his vineyards. And so it was just a fascinating afternoon being able to talk to him. I felt really privileged to be able to drive that far out, meet with him on a Sunday, to smell their Sunday dinner cooking in the kitchen and wafting through our tasting room while we're going through his wines. So Ranchi di Chiala is very special to me. Another one, just in the interest of time to keep things moving, I know I kind of go off, but
No, you're good.
we were just talking about Tuscany and Chianti Classico. And one winery that really stood out to me when I visited was Pogerino. And Pogerino is in Rada, and Piero Lanza is the winemaker there. And the tasting I had with him was just, one bullseye after another. The guy was just, every wine he was pouring was just so fantastic. But what really struck me about him, he's just very intelligent, a very thoughtful man. And the first wine he poured for me was a traditional method sparkling wine made entirely from Sangiovese. And he'd done everything. He'd done his research about champagne wines. And this wine was better than any champagne I'd had in 3 or 4 years. Like, it was so interesting because Sangiovese has that nice meaty characteristic to it. It's like kind of
Yeah.
savory. And this champagne was savory like that. So it was like seeing champagne through, Chianti colored glasses. if you can imagine that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that producer because I had a bottle of their 2020 Chianti Classico last night and
Just
absolutely
last night.
stunned. Yeah.
Okay,
Had
cool.
it
What'd you
with
think?
dinner last night. So, yeah,
Oh,
amazing.
cool. What did you think of it?
Thought it was absolutely beautiful. I could not put it down. I just wanted to nose it. I mean, I had it in the glass for about 30 minutes and my wife came up and took a nose of it and then actually took a sip. And I said, I hadn't had a drink of that yet. And she went, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry." I said, "No worries. I'm enjoying the nose so much. I'm just waiting to take a sip."
Yeah, that was like my tasting with him was just like every wine was like I just had to come back to it because I just wanted to do it justice. He's
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
if you
So
if you visit
funny you
Chianti
brought that one
Classico,
up. Yeah.
make that a stop. I mean, it's a beautiful farm. I think you can actually I think they have accommodations there too. So they actually have a small little agriturismo that you can stay at. Wonderful wines. I really like Pogerino. And then
So
yeah,
this had on the label Vendemmia. What does that represent? It was
yeah,
Vendemmia 2020.
yeah. That means vintage in Italian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
Okay. There
that's
you go. See, you learn something new every day.
yep. That's the year of its birth, right?
Okay.
I was talking about Valtellina earlier, and just to kind of circle back on that, any opportunity I have to tell people about the wines of our Pepe, I will. Our Pepe is a national treasure in Italy, and to me, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of space to cellar wines. I just don't. I have a wine refrigerator that's got a couple shelves devoted to it. Half of it is our Pepe because our Pepe is this is Valtellina again. So heroic viticulture, working with Nebbiolo. In that valley, they call it Chiuvanasca. That's the name of the grape, but it's a form of Nebbiolo. And what's so great about our Pepe, wonderful people, for one. I've met and chatted on a couple occasions with Isabella Pellizzati Perego, who's the enologist there. She does the work
Yeah.
with her brother, and those wines are they're very site specific. So there's different little sections and subzones of the area, and so they make one for each. But they age the wines in chestnut casks, which is actually not allowed in Barolo as a comparison to another Nebbiolo area. And there's something about the way this alchemy of chestnut and alpine Nebbiolo comes together that's just very, very unique to their wines. And they often don't release those wines for like 7 or 8 years.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so when they come onto the market, you'll see it. That's an older vintage. Well, it's actually the current release. So they're near and dear to my heart too, just because their wines are just they thread that needle of improbability that I think is just really interesting.
Is it distributed? Does that hit our markets here in the States, bigger markets?
It does. It does. So all three of these wineries that I've talked about are well represented. That's a good
Okay.
question you bring up because there are times where I will on a press tour they'll take us to a winery who's not imported to the United States, and I just choose not to write about it. I think it's important that for being an American website, even though I'm focused not on American wines, people are got to be able to buy these wines, so they are distributed.
Sure.
But they're the word is out on our Pepe a little bit. So I mean, they can be a little bit hard to come by. Some of their top of the line wines are in the $100 range. But to me, that's a wine I could spend $100 on and feel fine about. Like
Yeah.
it's they're really really special, and it's a special family too.
Yeah. Well, you want to head over to France?
Yeah, I mean, sure, if you've got time.
Yeah.
France for me, I just see it through a very different kind of perspective than I do the Italian wines because it's just so many of the classics that I love, And so, I mean, you'd asked me in kind of our first call, about things that are under the radar in France, and I'm firmly like in the camp of just like, man, give me a Chablis and I'm happy,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
champagne, like champagne's awesome. We should all be having champagne with dinner, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm the guy who's telling people that. And, Beaujolais Cru, those wines are very well covered, documented. But man, they do what they do very, very well. And it's very,
Yeah.
very specific, I think the other area that I would throw into that mix would be Chinon, which is on the Loire River, Saumur, kind of another area where you get those Cabernet Franc wines. Um,
Love them.
I love them
Yeah.
too. I do too. I know there's a lot of people who don't like that pyrazine bell pepper kind of thing
Mm.
with Cabernet Franc, and it's really heightened there. It's catnip for me. I'm like, what a cool smelling wine this is, So I love diving into that area. quite a bit.
Yep, yep. That's one of my favorites. I love Cab Franc. Getting ready to host a big Cab Franc dinner because I
Oh,
like it
great.
so much. But I also like the Loire Valley for their Sauvignon Blancs. I mean, I love Sancerre and the
Yeah.
Pouilly Fumé.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is
And
a great region.
to kind of tie the two together with Italy, just to go back to that, a lot of those Loire wines, if you have a side by side with the wines of Friuli, which is that northeastern part of Italy, you can find some great Cabernet Franc in Friuli. You can find
Yeah.
amazing Sauvignon from Friuli. It would be a real interesting kind of side by side comparison, to have those.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, I,
Here's a region. I want you to tell me a region I've found, I say recently, about a year, year and a half ago, that I've just been exploring and really enjoy the Jura.
yeah. Again, that's another area that it's honestly like there's a lot of. It depends on what's represented in your market, right? And
Yeah.
the Jura wines are really well represented in New York. They're well represented in the coasts, California, and then here in the middle of the country in Colorado, it's a lot of kind of the same producers,
Yeah.
Tissot, some of these other ones that are great. I really like the Chardonnay wines from the Jura, and I
Yeah.
think it's interesting. I believe it was the Sommelier's Atlas of Taste was the book where I was reading this, Rajat Par's book, where they talk about how the Jura is basically a mirror image of Burgundy, that like the clay to limestone ratio is like flipped. And so,
Yeah.
and it's near that area. And so, but also a region that I could stand to do a lot more tasting in and a lot more, diving into a little bit. One area that I really like that is kind of chronically overlooked is Alsace, and it's misunderstood. I think in part because the bottles don't fit in our wine refrigerators. um, that would be one reason. Another reason
Way
is
too
that
tall.
yeah.
Yeah.
Another reason is that they do varietal labeling there, so it that tends to like I've wondered if that makes it harder to market in a weird way because people don't expect that from French wine. That it's not about this wine came from Rickvier or it came from any of these other little towns in Alsace. It came from Alsace, so it's the whole region-wide appellation, and then they break things down underneath that. But what I really like about Alsace is for one, that there's so much organic and biodynamic winemaking done there because their climate's very friendly to it, and so they've actually been doing that for generations. And as a result, you find with a lot of these wineries, these family wineries, these small scale family wineries in Alsace, just a real nice kind of continuous thread of consistency through some of some of their higher end wines. And I think the traditions that they've upheld in Alsace, it's not uncommon to come across a family that's, we're in our ninth generation doing this.
Well, and it's kind of a unique wine region, right? Going back and forth. It's got that German kind of influence. When you think Alsace, for me, I think white wines. I think the
Yep.
Gewürz, I think Riesling, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris. Um, what I've not explored, but I'm sure there are red wines in this region, aren't there?
There are, and that's kind of an emerging story in Alsace is whether or not it's going to be a place to turn to for French Pinot Noir. They have just recently opened the door to two different vineyards being Grand Cru Pinot Noir in Alsace.
Oh,
Previously,
wow.
Pinot Noir was not a Grand Cru grape. Only Riesling, Pinot Gris, and Gewürztraminer, and I think there was one other, rare instance where
Pinot Blanc.
I think it wasn't quite Pinot Blanc. I have to double check,
Okay.
yeah, they it's the Grand Cru vineyards. They're all about Riesling. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Gewürztraminer is a very acquired taste, and sometimes in Alsace it's sweet, which is just a completely different head trip to taste a sweet Gewürztraminer. But it's been about Riesling, and with climate change, they've been able to get enough daylight hours and enough warmth that they can ripen Pinot Noir. But I think what you're also seeing is how long it takes to tinker with that to be able to get up to standards,
Yeah.
right? There's, like Albert Mann is another essential winemaker that I feature on the site. Albert Mann is a producer who's been working with Pinot Noir for a while and done a good job with it. And those wines can kind of reach, a Burgundy level, right? And I've had some other samples that have come through that they're maybe not as interesting or as complex. But I think given the pedigree that's in Alsace, I think given their desire to move in that direction, it's not going to be long before we're talking about Alsatian Pinot Noir.
Wow,
Um,
that's interesting.
yeah, I hope that they don't put them in those tall bottles, but that's just a
I
personal
hope not
grievance,
either.
because
Although,
I like to put them back in the fridge. Remember, that's like a key thing for me after having a glass
well,
or two, and they don't fit in the fridge.
well, that and just in the wine cellar, in the wine fridge, even
Yeah,
Pinot bottles for that matter.
yeah,
But
right.
everything's designed for a Bordeaux bottle, a
Right.
classic Bordeaux bottle. Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah. Well,
Another producer that I really like it from Alsace that I got to give mention to is Barmes Boucher.
okay,
They're a biodynamic producer. It's a brother and sister who manage the estate along with their mom, and they're just they make these wines that are just like, when we talk about a living wine, right? Like, the notion that, like, when you smell it, when you taste it, it feels like it has a life of its own.
yeah.
I think of this winery. This winery, every one of their white wines is just like so vivacious and bursting with life and complexity. And not many people know about them. They're a great winery. So it's fun to discover those kinds of gems when you travel to a place like Alsace.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I want to ask you, put you on the spot if you don't mind.
Sure.
Talking about gems, finding kind of a hidden gem. Most people when they think France, they're going to go right to Bordeaux and then to Burgundy.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks might have the opinion new into wine that, ooh, if you drink wine there, it's going to be pretty expensive.
Yep.
I've found that there are some still value regions in Bordeaux and in Burgundy. Do you have a couple that you like?
Yeah, particularly in Burgundy. I got to preface that, I do cover French wine. Bordeaux is a region that I've not done a great job covering in depth. And
Okay.
that's something that I'd like to fix and remedy. But I was just in Burgundy this year in June. Specifically, it was a private tour with the consortium of wine growers. I was a custom editorial trip, which was a great privilege. But when you've got a site like Opening a Bottle, they see how much of the work that goes into it. They were really happy to work with me on this. But what I wanted to do was see Burgundy in light of, how does someone who's not a collector, who doesn't have a trust fund, how do they approach this region and drink wines that are distinctive, that aren't also just something they can get in their own backyard because they're Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, right? I mean, we can drink
Right.
really great wines from the Willamette Valley and from, all sorts of different places within California that are those exact grape varieties. And so, Burgundy's kind of reaching that point right now where you're kind of wondering, well, if the harvests are getting smaller and the wines are getting more expensive, and I love Chardonnay, I love Pinot Noir, am I going to continue to drink from Burgundy? And there are a few regions there that I think are pretty interesting to pay attention to. Two of them would be the Haute Côte de Beaune and the Haute Côte de Nuits. So
Okay.
basically, Haute means high, and this is above the Côte de Beaune and above the Côte de Nuits. And we took a drive through and visited a winery in the Côte de Beaune, Haute Côte de Beaune, and saw some of the vineyards that are up there. And one of the advantages that they have up there is a little bit more biodiversity. So you have a little bit more of a mixed agriculture. You've got some pastures, you've got some forest. You don't have the pedigree of a Grand Cru, Premier Cru vineyard system. But because you're higher in elevation, you tend to have cooler temperatures. And a lot of the wineries that are in the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuits, they're starting to look a little bit higher up as an opportunity. Can we make our entry level wines be a mixture of fruit from up there if they're not doing that already? And
Right.
so, after coming back from there, I went to my local wine shop and was kind of looking around their shelves and was like, oh, look at that. They've got a Haute Côte de Beaune and they've got a Haute Côte de Nuits wine as well. And so, to me, that's an area within that's like right in the backyard of that area that is producing, has the potential to produce some wines that are pretty interesting, that are still benefiting from that immense knowledge base that Burgundy has for handling Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, for doing those wines that are in that more kind of lean, savory, complex style. They're not jammy, they're not fruity, they're not oaky. They're just kind of like this interesting balance that really defines that area. I'd look to the Haute Côte de Beaune and Haute Côte de Nuits. I think it's interesting. We also went to Côte de Chalonnaise. We also went to the Mâconnais. And of course, we went to a few wineries that had Grand Cru
No,
vineyards, and
yeah, you did.
went to Corton. So but nonetheless, I mean, the Mâconnais is an enormous area, and it's It's obviously the Chardonnay that comes from that area is going to be a little bit more solar. It's going to see a lot more sun. It's going to be a lot warmer. It's not going to taste like Chablis necessarily, but it's kind of the other end of the spectrum from Chablis. But there's some really interesting things happening there, and I think they've shed their image of being kind of the bargain basement wine, and they're starting to make some finer wines in that area. So
Yeah, those were my 2, the Chalonnés and the Macanones. So you hit those. Those are the
yeah,
ones that I've explored and really have come
yeah,
to appreciate. And again, you can go back to Chablis as well. Some
yeah,
people may not
sure.
realize that's part of Burgundy.
Oh, Chablis great, and you can some of the great producers, if they have a Petit Chablis, that's a great wine.
Oh yeah,
The Chablis Village wine, especially if it's from old vines, those can be, Premier Cru level taste. I mean, there's ways of drinking wines from Chablis that really fit that kind of mold. Um,
yeah,
but I will say, I mean, it is anyone's guess as to what the future holds for that region. It seems particularly in the crosshairs of climate change, and particularly in the form of, late season frosts and massive hailstorms. And
yeah.
even when I was there, the first day I was there, I showed up in the city of Macon, and a big old thunderstorm rolled through, and I was like, well, these are going to be some interesting conversations this next few days. And we went to one
Right.
winery where, they make Chardonnay wines, and the 2021s, they didn't have anything to show us because it had been so decimated by hail that their crop was so small it had long sold out. And this isn't, the Cote de Nuit or the Cote de Bon, it's the Mâconnais. So, this is a consideration that I think people who love that region, ought to pay attention to kind of some of these details and appreciate the fact that, you know, those wines may be expensive, but it's not like these winemakers are on easy street.
No, no, totally agree. And you're right about the climate change because even you talked about the late frost, and a lot of times it's after bud break,
Yeah.
and it's just brutal.
and
And
the tools that they have to fight something like that are really expensive. They can do
yeah,
one of two things. They can put candles in the vineyard to keep it warm overnight, and that's really manually intensive and expensive. Or they can spray water on the vines to protect the buds and encase them in ice. Again, water is in short supply. And
yeah,
you also have to have the irrigation lines to even do it in the first place. um, it's tricky. It's really a
yeah.
tricky thing.
Well, you mentioned a couple of essential winemakers that you liked in Alsace. Do you have a couple from other parts of France that
Yeah,
you would want to throw out?
I mean, we were just talking about Burgundy, and one winery that I just published last week is Etienne Delarche, and this is in Pernon-Vergelès, which is kind of tucked up behind the hill of Corton outside of Beaune. And it's one of those villages that you can, if you get a village wine from there, you're not breaking the bank necessarily, but you're drinking pretty well. And I really
Yeah,
like the Chardonnay wines that he was producing. He's very soft spoken, really lets his wines do the talking. But just really, I was actually, after writing it up, I was like, I might look into cellaring some of his wines too, just personally,
uh-huh.
and finding
Yeah.
out a few of them. There's this one Premier Cru vineyard that is right above Pernon-Vergelès, which is called Sous Fratil, I think is what it's called, and or Sous Fritier. I'm butchering it. My French isn't too great, but this
You're
is a
doing way better than I would.
this is a Chardonnay wine that was just like everything that I like about that grape. And I just did a class on Chardonnay and how a lot of people don't, kind of, there's a lot of Chardonnay haters out there, and you kind of know in the back of your mind, you're like, yeah, but you probably haven't had this, right?
That's exactly right.
This is one of those wines. This was like a textbook case of just, a beautiful wine coming from a gorgeous vineyard. The fruit was just really, really pure. There was a lot of complexity. There was a little bit of richness to it, but there was enough, that minerality to keep it honest, right? Like
Yeah.
it didn't get away from itself. And he's just a masterful winemaker who's very young, has a lot of potential. That would be one winery. I mentioned Barmes Boucher earlier. That's another essential winemaker of France that I've got a write up on. And then there's another one it's not a secret, but Clos Bon. Are you familiar with the wines of
Oh
Clos
yes.
Bon in Provence?
Yes.
Um, I mean, just to stay on brand for myself, I love improbable wines, like wines that are like, this shouldn't exist when you really find out their story, when you learn about what they do. And so the story of Clos Bon, this is in Provence. real close to the Mediterranean. They make a rosé wine out of Tiburon, which is over in Italy in Liguria, is known as Rossese, and it's just this very niche kind of Provençal grape that has its own kind of behavior, its own kind of difficulties in the vineyard. It really requires these certain conditions. So not only do they make a rosé out of that, they then age the wines in these enormous foeders, which are large oak casks. I want to say they're like 110 years old. And he told me that when he reaches a point every single year with one of the foeders where, as the wine is going into out of the barrel, rather, the pressure change is so great, he's worries that the whole cask is about to split. So
Wow.
he says a prayer every time he's taking the wine out of the cask, because he just doesn't want to lose the heritage of this 110-year-old barrel that has given so much character to who they are.
Sure.
And so, when you have a wine like that, it's so intimately tied to family history, intimately tied to the landscape, intimately tied to the cuisine. I mean, that's what it's all about for me. I just really, really enjoy spotlighting those unique little stories. Yeah. So those would be
Well,
a few ones to spotlight.
no, that's been awesome. I really appreciate, Kevin, you coming on and having a fun conversation today. It's been very informative for me, and I'm sure for the listeners as well. So thank you for doing this.
Look, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I mean, it's great to be able to connect with people. It's I write. This is my office. I'm always in my basement working on this stuff, and so I think one thing that doesn't get said is writers, when we do this stuff, we put it out there, and oftentimes we don't hear back from people, and we don't hear who read it, and are people finding it useful. So it's great that we connected, and it's great to be able to present to your audience. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah, and hopefully you take a couple more of these trips, you do some more things. Maybe you'll be open to coming back on, and we can have another conversation down the road.
well, I hope you and I get to meet sometime, and we can open a bottle together.
I
It'd be great.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
open something
Well,
old.
let everybody know one more time where they can find your website. I also
Sure.
want to make sure you mention to them any social media. I know, you're a
Yeah, sure.
photographer and you
Yeah.
are on Instagram. So let them know everywhere they can find you.
I am. Yeah. So I am on my website, openingabottle.com. Super simple. So www.openingabottle.com. And then all of my social media is at opening a bottle. I'm most active on Instagram. I wasn't getting much out of Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called now. For me, wine Twitter was a place where people got into arguments about wine, and it just wasn't my scene. So I'm not very active there. And semi-active on Facebook. But most of what I do social media wise is on Instagram, because it's a photographer's medium. So I do
Sure.
share some photos there. But then I also have a separate website, which I don't really promote a whole lot. It's actually linked to from the About section. It says Our Photography on Opening a Bottle. That's a separate domain. That's photos.openingabottle.com. And there you can go through my whole photography portfolio if you want to, kick around and visit a lot of different destinations and see the
Oh, that's
imagery that
very
I've
cool.
shot. So photos.openingabottle.com. It's actually a different domain. It's a stock photography website through Photo Shelter that I manage.
Is it
Um,
sorted by country and things like that?
it is, yeah, it is. So it opens up with this big shot of some champagne bottles in a riddling rack in a cave in Champagne. And as you'll see that there's a little navigation there. If you click through on that little, the little bars, what they call a hamburger
Yeah.
navigation, it'll open up. There's galleries from Friuli, Venezia Giulia from last November, from Abruzzo in June, Alsace, Barolo, Mosel River. So hopefully those are things that I actually, when I plan a vacation, I like to look at stock photography sometimes, like not like the cheesy, iStock,
Yeah.
with the models and a clock or whatever, that the weird stuff that they have on stock photography. But if you find like a photojournalism website and you look at destinations, you can get a real good sense for like how pretty a place might be. So
Well, and I think about when you talk about drinking a bottle of wine, you start to think about where this is from and who's making it, and the story behind it. Being able to go to that website and look at, pull up some of those photos and really go, man, this came from
yeah,
there.
I tell you that
So
the end game for me that I'm working towards is eventually, one, writing a book that has photography in it that's wine oriented, and then two would be to lead a trip over there that is wine and photography specific.
oh yeah.
Just to take people to a wine region, open some cellar doors that I've come to know, showcase those kinds of things, be able to work with a travel partner who can kind of do some of the logistics. I think that'll just be a lot of fun to eventually work up that way. So,
oh, absolutely. Something to look forward to for us.
Someday.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Kevin. Really appreciate you
coming
on.
I gotta say, Rob, I really have enjoyed listening to your podcast lately, and cranking through it when I'm doing some work. You're doing a great job, and it's been an honor to be a part of it.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.